Mike Tyson vs. Roy Jones Jr. sold 1.2 million pay-per-views. That's around 350,000 more than Tyson Fury vs. Deontay Wilder 2. So a highly anticipated rematch between two undefeated heavyweights in their prime sold around 30% less pay-per-views than an exhibition match between two fighters over the age of 50. I don't think there's much overlap between those who bought the pay-per-view for Tyson vs. Jones and those who bought the pay-per-view to watch a YouTuber fight a retired NBA player. But either way, it reflects very poorly on the state of boxing that this sold more than an actually relevant fight. The card was sponsored by a TikTok knockoff app and what I can only assume is a cannabis company. The media personalities who were covering the event ranged from the Saved by the Bell guy to Sugar Ray Leonard to Mauro Ranallo and Snoop Dogg. In between the fights was some kind of popular music concert.
This sounds like rock and or roll.
I can't tell you who these music people are, so I won't even try. With this event, it really seemed like they were trying to appeal to both the combat sport fan base with Mauro, Israel Adesanya, and Sugar Ray Leonard, as well as to the Jake Paul fan base with the concerts and the Snoop Dogg on commentary. And to be fair to Snoop, he seemed much more knowledgeable about boxing than the average person. But there's just not enough depth in his commentary for someone who's actually interested in the fight. Mauro was of course trying to hype up the fight as much as he could. Israel did a good job considering it was his first attempt at broadcasting. And Sugar Ray seemed content to just collect his check. He barely even spoke. 4 people is too many in a commentary booth. And with Mauro and Snoop dominating the mic, we didn't hear much from Adesanya, and much less from Leonard. If you like the direction this video is going, please give it a like, thanks. I will get to Tyson vs. Jones in a moment, but first I want to talk a little bit about the co-main event, where we saw a former professional athlete get dominated by a YouTuber. I don't know who Jake Paul is aside from that he's a big YouTuber, but anyone who watches basketball knows Nate Robinson from winning all those dunk contests in spite of being a man of average height. I figured if both are starting from zero boxing or combat sport experience, Robinson should have a much faster learning curve due to his having been one of the top athletes in the league full of the top athletes. But judging by his performance, it looked like he didn't even train at all. It was a circus show. And of course, even in an exhibition match between two men who should be retired, we get a BS decision. The judges scored the fight a draw. Mike didn't agree with the decision, but he took it well.
Mr. Tyson, what do you think of that?
I'm good with that.
You think you won the fight?
Yeah, but I'm good with a draw.
No one loves Roy Jones Jr. more than me, but I have trouble finding a single round that he won. The rounds were all more or less the same. Tyson looked quite sharp and found his range fairly early on. Jones tried to keep him at the end of his jab and invariably would become compelled to hold on for dear life and bring the action to a grinding halt. If I had to give one round to Jones, it would be the 6th because Tyson didn't land quite as many punches. But in the other 7 rounds, Tyson comfortably outlanded Jones, and his punches seemed to be doing far more damage, especially the body shots. Before the fight, I was actually leaning Jones due to Tyson not having fought in 15 years and Jones having fought and won fairly recently. But as the fight unfolded, you realize why Tyson was constantly imposing his will and why Jones was compelled to grind his way to a decision. You know those kung fu movies with choreographed fight scenes that you imagine can't possibly ever take place in real life? Well, they can, but it takes a once-in-a-generation man to do it. Roy Jones Jr. learned how to fight by watching roosters and kung fu movies.
I'm also big on the kung fu movies. So the kung fu movies, they got tiger style, crane style,
Right.
all these, the toad, the lizard, all these different things. So I said, I love the roosters. So let me see how I can incorporate the roosters into my style. My father had roosters. So I would watch the roosters all the time because roosters develop a pecking order. They develop a pecking order on their own anyway. So I would always watch them to figure out what made one the king of the pecking order, what made him better than the rest. Once I would figure them out, I start emulating those things in my boxing style.
Mike Tyson's style was taught to him by Cus D'Amato, one of the greatest boxing minds of all time. This was a matchup of styles, and Mike's style has simply aged better than Roy's. It's almost cliche to say that prime Roy Jones Jr. was just an athlete, and that as soon as his athleticism declined, so did his fighting prowess. This isn't fair. Prime Jones was supremely technical, and there are many other better videos that can explain his unique defense and his unique way of generating power. But the issue was that the techniques Roy Jones Jr. had developed, apparently from watching movies and livestock, were very much predicated on him being Roy Jones Jr. Not everyone could have made that style work, and that's what we saw last Saturday. So in retrospect, it makes sense that Tyson won the fight, but now I just prefer if both of them stayed out of the ring and that Roy replaced Snoop in the commentary booth. And if you like hearing our dumbass opinions on combat sports, please consider subscribing.